I wasn't in a good place that January, and that's the plainest way I know to say it. I was 42, on unpaid leave from line work after a shoulder strain that should have healed faster than it did, sleeping in my late father's trapper cabin above the Elk River Basin like I was trying to outweight myself. The cabin sat on inherited ground my family had held long enough for the corners of every story to wear smooth, and I had driven up there alone with 2 duffels, a rifle I barely touched, and a shame I kept tucked down where I thought no one could see it. Shame has a way of showing anyway. My name's Brett Lawson, and I spent most of my adult life believing the world made sense if you carried the right tools and didn't panic. You learned to read load, torque, weather, and timing. You learned the order of repairs. You swapped out what failed, you braced what sagged, you kept power moving. That was my framework, and it served me well through storms, ice, and the kind of long shifts that leave your hands cramped even after a hot shower. Grief didn't fit that framework. There was no bracket for it, no clean splice, no line item for how to answer a phone when your own kid has called 7 times in a month and you've let it ring out because hearing his voice makes you feel smaller than silence. The road into the property climbed through fir and lodgepole, then leveled into a shelf where the cabin leaned into a windbreak of old spruce. My father had built it before I was born, back when his back was straight, and he still trusted maps he drew himself on scrap cedar. By the time I inherited it, the porch rail bowed a little, the chimney stones had shifted, and the north window stuck unless you lifted and pushed at the same time. I knew all those faults by feel, because I'd grown up fixing them beside him. That was the hard part. Every board held his thumbprint and his stubbornness, and I had missed his final night in hospice because I told myself I would come at first light, rested, clear-headed, ready. He died at 2:17 a.m. while I slept through the call. Juniper came with me because she would have torn the back seat apart if I left her in town, and because, if I'm honest, she was the one living thing I could stand being fully known by. Blue heeler, 10 years old, grey coming into her muzzle, smart enough to read me and decent enough not to make a fuss about what she read. The first morning at the cabin, she did a full perimeter check, like she was taking inventory on my behalf, then came back and sat by the steps, waiting for me to catch up. She had this way of glancing over her shoulder, ears half-cocked, like she expected me to do the sensible thing for once. My days settled into a pattern that looked productive from 10 feet away and hollow from inside. I got up before dawn because the cold shoved me awake anyway. I coaxed the stove, hauled water from the barrel where it stayed just this side of ice, and cooked oatmeal with too much salt, because my father used to say sugar made a man careless. Then I chopped wood whether we needed it or not. I checked the old fence line, though there was no stock to hold. I patched rabbit-chewed wiring in the shed. I cleaned tools that weren't dirty. I ate standing up at the counter because sitting at the table meant seeing the chair he used. By the first week of January, I could tell you the precise minute the light left the basin each afternoon, and none of that precision made me feel less lost. My son, Eli, was 16 and living with his mother 2 counties over, old enough to be sharper than I was, and young enough to still call, even when I didn't deserve it. The phone service at the cabin came and went with weather, but missed calls stacked up whenever I drove down the ridge where a signal held. Eli's name would light up the screen in that blue-white way, calm and neutral, while my pulse acted like I was bracing for impact. I listened to one voicemail 3 times and still didn't call back. "Hey, Dad, it's me. Just checking in. Mum says you're up at Grandpa's place. I got my permit test on Thursday. I wanted to tell you before, after. Call me when you can." No anger in it. That was worse. There was one conversation from hospice that replayed itself whenever I lay down. and it never softened with repetition. The nurse had called around midnight, voice steady and kind in that professional way that leaves no place to hide. Mr. Lawson's breathing has changed. If you wanted to come sit with him, now would be a good time. I looked at the clock, looked at the blowing snow outside my apartment then, and said, "I'll be there at dawn. Roads are bad." She paused half a beat and answered, "I understand." I heard what she didn't say. Dawn was for people who had more time than he did. At the cabin, weather made every feeling physical. Black January cold came down the drainage and pooled in low ground, a hard, dry cold that found the seam at your glove cuff and stayed there. When wind rolled through the firs, the sound wasn't dramatic. It was a low freight of air that rubbed branch on branch until your teeth set. The river below stayed mostly unfrozen where current pinched through rock, and at night you could hear it moving under skim ice like someone shifting in bed. Juniper slept by the stove, twitching sometimes at dreams I hoped were simple. I slept in my father's wool shirt because it still held a cedar and diesel smell if I breathed deep enough. I kept trying to reason my way clear. That was the old habit, and old habits feel like competence even when they are just repetition. If I listed tasks, then the day had shape. If the day had shape, then I wasn't failing. If I wasn't failing, then maybe missing one night in hospice was a bad event, not a character flaw. Then Eli would call again, and I'd watch the screen go dark while the cabin clicked and settled around me. And I would think in that stubborn present tense that had trapped me for months. I fix things. I show up late and work harder. I pay what I owe. I do not sit still where I can hear my own excuses. The trouble was, grief is mostly stillness, and excuses are loud when nothing else is. Every 10 days or so, I drove into Alder Creek for propane, dog food, and whatever fresh produce hadn't frozen in transit. The clerk at Morrow's Mercantile, Dale Hensley, had known my father longer than I'd been alive and treated everybody like they were, one bad week from needing help with a chainsaw or a roof leak. He scanned my things, set a sack of coffee on top, and said, "You settling in all right up there?" I said, "As good as can be." He nodded without looking up. "Your dad used to say that when he meant the opposite. You want folks leaving you be? We can do that. You need a hand? We can do that too." I thanked him and carried the bags out before I had to answer honestly. Driving back up, I passed the hospice turnoff and gripped the wheel hard enough my shoulder lit up. Snow had drifted over the lower fences. Deer tracks stitched the ditches. Around mile marker 9, where the grade steepened, I pulled over and let Juniper out. She trotted in a short loop, came back, and rested her chin on my knee while I stood there in the thin sun and looked at nothing in particular. I remember thinking I had become a man with too many private ledgers, one for work, one for father, one for son, each overdue in a different currency. I laughed once, dry and humorless, because if there had been an award for avoiding difficult phone calls, I would have mounted it on the mantel. The cabin felt colder that evening, even after I fed the stove. Shadows came early, blue and grainy through the window glass. I ate canned stew with crackers and sat at the table anyway. My father's chair across from me like an accusation and an invitation at the same time. Juniper huffed in her sleep. Somewhere up the ridge, a branch gave a long creak under snow load, then settled. I said out loud, just to hear a human voice in the room, "You're doing a fine job, Lawson. Real masterclass in emotional adulthood." It came out so deadpan I almost smiled. Almost. I washed the bowl, checked the latch, and stood on the porch in my coat while frost formed on the rail. The basin below was a dim spread of timber and white draw lines where old slides had cut through. No lights except mine. No engines. No voices, just river sound and cold, and the faint resin smell of split pine stacked under tarp. The isolation was what I came for, and after a while it started to feel less like refuge and more like a mirror that didn't blink. By the second week of January, I understood I wasn't up there to heal so much as to stop running long enough to admit I'd been running. I still didn't know what to do next. I just knew the pretending was wearing thin, and the mountain, in its patient way, was waiting me out. I stayed on the porch until my toes went numb, not because I was seeing anything worth seeing, but because going back inside meant choosing the same four walls again and admitting I had nowhere else I wanted to be. Frost had started to feather along the top rail, silver at first, and then white as the temperature dropped, and I traced one line with my glove like I was checking a seam. The basin gave me its usual sounds in small pieces: river under ice, fir boughs lifting and settling, Juniper's tag tapping the door when she shifted in her sleep. Nothing dramatic, just winter doing winter. I stood there long enough for the stars to come clean overhead, and for my thoughts to drift back to the same places they always went when I ran out of work to hide behind. Inside, the stove had gone from lively to steady, the way my father liked it overnight. I banked it, set the kettle for morning, and sat on the edge of the bed without taking my boots off. The room smelled like wool, smoke, and old pine planks that had soaked up 50 years of weather. I could see his hands in every fix: the patched ceiling seam above the lamp, the bent nail he never replaced by the door, the shelf he measured by eye and got level anyway. I kept hearing that hospice nurse in my head, calm and practiced, giving me one chance in plain language. If you wanted to come sit with him, now would be a good time. I had answered like a man pricing risk on a bad road. I had mistaken logistics for love. That was the truth of it, and once I said it to myself cleanly, it sat in the room like a fifth wall. Sleep came in short pulls. I'd close my eyes, drift, then wake to a pop from the stove, or Juniper turning over on the rug. Somewhere around midnight I gave up and put on coffee that tasted burned no matter what I did to it, then sat by the window in the dark and watched my own reflection ghost over the trees. I remember thinking in that trapped present tense again. I am 42 years old, and I can reroute power through a storm, but I can't dial my own sun. I am old enough to know better, and stubborn enough to call this caution. I am tired of carrying every grief like a tool belt I refuse to set down, because setting it down would mean admitting I am not fixing a thing. Juniper came over and leaned her shoulder into my knee with the full, practical weight of a working dog who had no patience for self-pity. I scratched behind her ears, and she sighed like she had been waiting all evening for me to quit rehearsing old failures and pay attention to what was in front of me. "You and me," I said quietly. "Top-tier emotional support operation." She thumped her tail twice and went back to her rug. I laughed into my cup, low enough not to wake anyone who wasn't there, and that laugh did more for me than the coffee. It was a small, human sound in a cabin that had started to feel like a courtroom. By dawn, the cold had sharpened. Window glass wore a white edge, and the water bucket had a skin of ice I punched through with the back of a spoon. I fed Juniper, pulled on layers, and stepped out into a morning so clear it seemed cut from blue metal. My routine said fence line first, then creek crossing, then wood. And I followed it, because routine still gave me a rail to hold. Down by the crossing, the alder stems were glazed with rime and bowed over the narrow track where I usually checked for washout. Juniper ran ahead, barking once at a magpie and once at nothing in particular, then stopped so suddenly her nails scratched on crusted snow. She didn't stiffen. That's what got me first. No raised hackles, no hard stare, no circling. She just sat, ears relaxed, tail laid easy behind her. She looked from me to the far side of the crossing and back, like she was waiting for me to notice what was already obvious to her. In the snow beyond the culvert were tracks I had no clean category for. Deep, long, human-shaped in the broad sense, but too large by a margin that made me kneel and measure with my glove anyway. The stride was long and even, passing across the drainage and angling up toward timber, never turning toward the cabin. No sign of hurry. No sign of a chase. Just weight placed with care. Each print clear at toe and heel where the powder had settled overnight. I stood there too long with my mouth half open, then did what practical men do when faced with something outside their framework. I looked for the nearest normal answer and reached for it hard. Big hunter boots with snow collapse. Somebody playing a joke. Melt and refreeze distortion. I checked depth, edge crumble, overlay. None of my explanations held shape for more than a minute. Juniper got up, walked to the nearest print, sniffed once, and sat again, calm as a porch dog in July. "You're not helping me," I told her. She blinked and looked past me toward the cabin. When I came back up the rise, I saw what she had seen. The tarp flap over my dry kindling stack had worked loose in the night. I had rushed the tie off yesterday and left one corner slack, and snow had blown in under it. Except the front row of kindling wasn't wet. Someone, or something, had moved the driest splits inward and stacked a neat shoulder-high column under the tight part of the tarp, then weighted the loose flap with 2 flat stones from the creek bed so it wouldn't lift again. The stack was cleaner than my own work. Not showy, not decorative, functional, thoughtful. It made no sense, and it made perfect sense in the same breath. I set my hand on the stones and felt cold seep through the glove. "All right," I said to nobody I could see. "That's neighborly." My own voice sounded strange in the morning, like I hadn't used it enough to keep it tuned. I checked around for boot prints, tire tracks, anything that put a human body to the task. There were none near the porch, only wind-textured snow and Juniper's loops from before breakfast. The large prints from the crossing didn't come this close. Whatever had crossed down there had stayed down there. I carried a few armloads inside and lined them by the stove, each split piece dry and ready, and I felt a thin thread of gratitude I didn't know where to tie. 3 days passed with the same hard weather and a pattern that pressed at the edge of my understanding without once turning menacing. Juniper began waiting at dusk near the bend above the creek, sitting in that same patient posture with her ears easy and her gaze fixed on alder shadow. Twice I found little arrangements in plain sight that looked accidental until I looked twice. Wintergreen boughs laid beside the chopping block where I set my gloves, then 2 smooth river stones crossed on the porch rail where frost usually formed first. I picked those stones up, turned them in my hand, and put them back exactly as I found them, like disturbing them would be rude in a way I couldn't justify. By the second evening after the tracks, the forest settled into an unusual quiet around sundown. Not dead quiet, not the tense hush before weather breaks. More like the whole basin had agreed to lower its voice at once. The creek still moved. A raven called once, then went still. Even the wind seemed to choose the higher ridge and leave the shelf where the cabin sat untouched. I stood on the porch in my coat, Juniper at my heel, looking into timber that held its own secrets the way old men hold a prayer. I could feel my skepticism working in me, trying to reassemble a practical world from whatever this was. I could also feel it tiring. I whispered, "Thank you," to the trees before I could talk myself out of it. The words fogged in front of me and disappeared. A second later, I gave a short laugh at myself, warm and a little embarrassed. "You hear this?" I said to Juniper. I grew up in these mountains and just thanked lumber like it baked me a pie. She wagged once without taking her eyes off the dark line of alder. I stayed there until the cold drove me in, and when I latched the door behind us, the cabin no longer felt like a courtroom. It felt, for the first time in months, like I might be sharing a boundary with something I didn't need to solve, to respect. I stood with my hand on the latch for a few seconds after that thought landed, listening to Juniper circle once on her rug and settle. The cabin held its regular sounds: stove tick, timber creak, kettle lid giving a soft rattle as steam built, but my own head was quieter than it had been in months. Not peaceful, not yet, just less crowded. I hung my coat, set my gloves by the door, and looked through the window at the porch rail where those crossed stones sat in a thin line of frost, like a mark somebody had left for me on purpose. I should have gone to bed. Instead, I pulled a yellow legal pad from the drawer where my father kept hunting tags and fuel receipts, and wrote down what I'd seen so I couldn't smooth it over by morning. Tracks at creek crossing. Too large for boot, even stride. Did not approach cabin. Kindling restacked under tarp. 2 flat stones used as weights. No other prints near porch. I stared at the page a while, then added, Juniper calm at all signs. That line mattered more than the measurements. Juniper had never lied to me in her life, and she had no use for drama. By the time I banked the stove and stretched out under 2 wool blankets, I was thinking less about hospice and more about the bend above the creek where she kept waiting at dusk. That shift in itself felt strange. Grief had been the only channel open in me for so long that any new current seemed suspect. I lay in the dark with one arm over my eyes and tried to name what had taken its place. Not fear, not hope either. Curiosity, plain and practical, the same kind that makes you take apart a failed switch just to see exactly where it burned. I could work with curiosity. Morning came, sharp and bright. Frost on the inside corners of the windows. Smoke from the chimney climbing straight up in still air. I fed Juniper, poured coffee, and we went down to the crossing while the snow still held edge detail. The big prints had softened overnight, but not enough to erase shape. I used a folding ruler from my toolkit and measured the cleanest one heel to toe, then width at the forefoot. I measured stride from one left print to the next left print, and wrote all of it down with numb fingers. The numbers didn't solve anything. They only made denial harder. On the way back, I noticed a lodgepole branch laid across the narrow side trail I used to cut towards the lower fence. It hadn't blown there. The butt end was braced against a stump and the top angled down deliberate as a gate. I stepped around and looked past it. The creek edge at that point had undercut and glazed over, a thin shell with moving water beneath. One more step in low light and I could have broken through to the knee, maybe worse if the bank collapsed. I stood there, branch in hand, and felt that same thread of gratitude tighten again. Somebody had seen the weak spot and marked it in a language I could understand. Inside, while oatmeal thickened on the stove, I checked my phone where it sat by the window hunting for 1 bar of service. 2 missed calls from Eli. 1 text, "You alive up there?" I typed 3 different replies and erased them. Finally I sent, "I'm okay." At the cabin, "Will call when I get signal in town. Proud of your permit test." It was too short and 3 days late, but it was the first straight line I'd thrown him in weeks. He answered almost right away. "Thanks. Be safe. Love you." I held the phone a long minute after the screen went dark, then set it face down and let myself breathe. That afternoon passed in ordinary work, and ordinary felt less like punishment than it had before. I split a half cord, tightened the hinge on the shed door, shook snow from the tarp lines, and found myself glancing toward the alder line every so often, without even meaning to. Juniper stayed close until late light. then drifted toward the same bend she had claimed the last few evenings, and sat there with her tail curled around her paws. She looked back once, not urgent, just checking whether I was coming. I wiped my hands on my jeans, grabbed my coat, and followed. By the fourth evening after I first saw the tracks, the cold settled in layers you could feel from ankle to face as the basin dropped into shadow. We took the deer path above the crossing and stopped where spruce gave way to alder thicket and open patches of sedge frozen stiff. A faint smell came off the creek, iron and stone and old leaves caught under ice. Somewhere down drainage a raven gave one rough call, then silence folded in again. That same chapel quiet I still didn't have a better name for. Juniper stood now instead of sitting, ears forward but relaxed, weight even across all 4 feet. I crouched beside her and stayed still long enough for my breathing to slow. Present tense took me again, the way it did when my mind decided the past could wait. I am not hunting. I am not proving anything. I'm a grown man kneeling in snow beside a dog, listening for branches that do not break. I tell myself, this is a person, a neighbor, somebody with big snowshoes and a habit of leaving odd gifts. I tell myself elk can throw shape in low light, and distance can stretch scale. I tell myself isolation makes patterns out of weather, and guilt makes those patterns feel personal. I tell myself to stand up, go inside, eat stew, call my son again, be sensible. But my body stays where it is. Juniper's tail gives one slow sweep. Somewhere ahead, something large shifts weight. With care I can hear but barely see, and I know, somehow, I'm not in danger. The sound came first, soft and measured. Snow compressing, pause, then a branch bending with a low creak and easing back without the crack you'd expect under heavy load. A shape moved behind older stems maybe 60 yards out, too broad at shoulder to be deer, too upright in its transitions to be bear, though it used all 4 limbs for a moment as it came down a little bank and then rose again. I caught only sections at first, dark fur against darker trunks, a forearm long as a shovel handle, the line of a back that sat higher than any man I had ever stood next to. Every motion had intention. It placed each step like it was choosing not to disturb more than necessary. Juniper surprised me then by trotting 3 paces into the open and stopping with her head low and tail moving easy. She didn't bark. She didn't submit either. She looked like she does when greeting an older ranch dog she respects, polite and steady. The figure paused. For a couple of heartbeats, all I could see was stillness and scale, this immense outline half-veiled by stems, silvered with frost. Then it shifted just enough for me to see a hand, if hand is the right word, open and empty at its side, fingers long, palm turned slightly away from us. Not a warning, more like courtesy. I don't know what possessed me, but I stood up slowly, kept my own hands visible and said, quiet as I could, evening. My voice sounded small in that wide place. The figure turned its head toward me. The last stripe of light had dropped to a narrow band over the far ridge, and in that band I saw eyes catch amber brown, calm and direct, nothing wild in them, nothing cornered. I've had hard eye contact with men looking for a fight and with animals deciding whether to bolt. This was neither. This was attention without pressure. A mule deer doe stepped out from behind a spruce 30 feet to the figure's left, thin-flanked from winter and carrying herself careful on the crust. She lowered her head to browse exposed twigs and never startled. 2 chickadees flicked through the alder tops and kept feeding. The whole scene held a non-trivial contradiction. My practical mind couldn't dismantle. An animal of that size should have bent the moment toward alarm by sheer presence, and yet every other creature around it read the posture before I did and stayed at ease. The prevailing logic of the woods that evening wasn't fear, it was boundary and respect. The figure eased down onto what looked like a fallen log just inside the alder shadow. It moved slowly enough that I could track each joint, knees folding, one hand bracing, shoulders rounding forward in a posture that reminded me of men resting on bucket seats after 12-hour shifts. Not human, not close, and yet there was something familiar in the patience of it. Juniper sat in the snow and watched. I found myself sitting too, because standing felt rude and because my legs had started to shake from something that wasn't cold. We stayed that way for, I don't know how long, just sharing distance while evening thinned into blue. Once the figure reached down, picked up a snapped alder whip, and set it aside with 2 fingers so it wouldn't spring back into the narrow game trail. Another small, practical kindness. My mind kept making and discarding explanations. Reclusive giant, some biological outlier, a trick of light stretched past reason. Evidence suggests I saw what I saw, and my body believed it before my language did. I had spent a year refusing to sit with anything I couldn't fix. There in the snow, I sat anyway. When the cold finally worked through my boots, I rose carefully and touched 2 fingers to my brow, in a gesture I hadn't used since helping old ranchers through narrow gates, a plain sign of respect. "Good night," I said. The figure inclined its head once. Then it stood, unfolding to a height that made the alder seem waist-high, stepped backward into timber with that same deliberate care, and was gone so quietly, the absence felt seamless. No crashing exit, no performance, just dark trunks, frost haze, and the creek moving under ice. Juniper came back to my side and leaned against my leg, warm and solid. I laughed under my breath, a short, shaky sound. "I just said goodnight to something taller than my porch roof," I told her. "If you start driving the truck, we're really in trouble." She sneezed, offended by the joke or the cold, then started up the trail toward the cabin like we had chores waiting. I took one last look at the alder line before following. On the porch rail when we got home, the crossed stones were still where I had left them, rimmed in white, quiet as a promise. I left the stones where they were, opened the door, and stopped again with one boot on the threshold, because Juniper had gone still behind me. Not stiff, just listening. Her ears tipped toward the lower meadow beyond the alder, and a long, low wolf call lifted out of the basin, thinned by distance and cold, until it sounded almost like boo on wire. Then another answered farther east, then 3 short notes together, rough and tired. Juniper looked up at me, not anxious, waiting for a decision. I grabbed my coat again, clipped her lead to her collar for the first stretch, and took the headlamp without turning it on. Moonlight on fresh crust was enough once our eyes adjusted. The trail down from the cabin cut through spruce shade and opened in patches where old blowdown had cleared years back. And every exposed place carried that deep black January bite that worked through denim and wool. The second wind found a seam. We moved slowly, more listening than walking, boots and paws making small squeaks in the top layer of snow. Another wolf call rolled across the drainage, then silence settled in behind it, like a held breath. By the time we reached the bend above the creek, the moon had climbed clear of the ridge and laid a dull silver sheet over the frozen meadow below. I crouched, unclipped Juniper, and put a hand on her chest to feel what she felt. Her breathing stayed easy, tail low, not tucked. She looked out over the meadow, then at me, then back again. I followed her line and saw movement at the far edge where timber met open ground, a dark shape crossing from left to right, too tall by any ordinary measure, each step placed with the same deliberate care I had watched at dusk. I told myself this couldn't be real in any way I could explain to another person without hearing my own voice turn thin. I told myself moonlight stretches distance, that cold makes depth hard to read, that a stand of alder can turn one body into two if you catch it wrong. I told myself a lot of things while that figure eased down near a low hump in the snow and stayed there. None of my arguments changed what I was seeing. Juniper took one step forward, then sat again, and in that simple choice she made, my skepticism feel like a tool from the wrong trade. We moved closer in short intervals, using spruce trunks for cover more out of habit than fear, until we reached a point where I could see the whole meadow in pieces. A grey wolf lay on its side near the centre, old by the look of its muzzle, and lean through the flank in the hard winter light. Around that wolf, maybe 40 to 50 yards out, 6 others held a loose ring. They were not charging in. They were not scattered. They paced, stopped, watched, shifted, and watched again, each one carrying the narrow look of hunger and cold. Frost rimed their whiskers, their breath ghosted in pale streams, and beside the old wolf sat the giant. He was angled slightly away from the ring, one massive forearm resting across his knees, the other hand laid open near the old wolf's ribs without pressing. He did not crowd it. He did not restrain it. He simply stayed. That was the part that reached me first. The scale was beyond my frame of reference, yes, shoulders broad enough to hide a stump I could barely straddle, head level with the lower boughs of a young fir when he shifted upright for a moment. But the prevailing fact in that meadow was restraint. Everything in him that could have dominated the scene had chosen patience instead. A younger wolf tested the boundary once, moving in at a shallow angle with ears half back and careful steps. The giant turned his head, lifted his hand a few inches from the snow, palm outward, and held it there. No swat, no rush, just a line drawn in calm. The younger wolf stopped, looked toward the elder on the ground, then backed away and resumed the ring. I had spent years around stock dogs, horses, and men who knew how to hold space without yelling. I recognized the grammar of it, even though I had never seen it spoken by anything like this. Juniper leaned against my leg and made a soft sound in her throat. I whispered, "Easy, girl," though she was already easier than I was. My heart was working hard enough that I could feel it in my cold fingertips. I tried to slow my breathing and felt my old instincts fight for control. Assess threat, map exits, keep distance, minimize unknowns. Another part of me, quieter but steadier, kept answering back. Look at the wolves. Look at your dog. Look at his hands. I am not in danger. I am watching mercy happen in a place where I had only expected survival. He turned then, not sharply, just enough to bring his face toward our spruce cover. Moonlight caught one eye, amber-brown and clear. He saw us. I knew he saw us because every part of his attention gathered for a second and settled on me without hardening. I had the odd, almost embarrassing urge to introduce myself like we were 2 men arriving early to a work site. Instead, I gave the smallest nod I could manage. "Evening," I whispered, because apparently that was my full vocabulary in the presence of the unexplainable. He held my gaze one breath longer, then looked back to the old wolf and resumed his stillness, as if to say the important work was there. The relief that moved through me was so sudden I almost laughed. I did laugh once under my breath, because I was crouched in snow talking politely to a giant while my blue heeler judged my composure. "If you tell anybody I was nervous," I murmured to her, "I'll deny it and blame the altitude." Her tail thumped my boot twice. The wind picked up just after midnight and carried needle-fine snow off the ridge. It stung any exposed skin and laid a new skin of glitter over old tracks until edges blurred. The ring of wolves adjusted with it, tightening slightly on the lee side and widening where drift built against deadfall. The old wolf's breaths had become visible from where I stood, slow pulls that lifted its ribs and fell with effort. The giant shifted once to shield its head from the wind, turning his body broadside to the gust and lowering one arm so the old wolf could tuck closer without strain. It was a practical move, the same way you'd angle a truck door against sleet so a kid could climb in dry. Juniper trembled once, not fear, just cold. I had tucked an extra pair of gloves in my pocket, but not the wool pad I usually carried for her on long sits. I cursed myself quietly and started to back us toward the trees, where I could clear a spot down to Needles. The giant looked over again, then at Juniper, then at a pile of wind-thrown spruce boughs half buried 10 yards to his right. He rose in one smooth motion that made every wolf in the ring freeze in place, walked to the pile, and gathered a thick armful. He did not approach us directly. He set the boughs midway between our spruce and his position, then stepped back and sat again beside the old wolf. I waited, not wanting to read intent where there was none. He looked at the boughs once, then at Juniper, then away. Deliberate, unmistakable. "All right," I said softly. "Thank you." I moved out, slow and open-handed, picked up the boughs and carried them back to our tree line. The cut ends were fresh and resinous, dry under the snow, and when I spread them into a thick mat, the scent rose clean and sharp. Juniper circled once, lay down on them with a long sigh, and tucked her nose under her tail. Warm enough off the ice crust. She kept her eyes on the meadow and drifted in and out without tension. I sat beside her on my heels and felt something in my chest give way that had been clenched for months. No one teaches you how to receive care when you've built your whole identity on providing it. I had spent a year treating help like accusation and tenderness like a debt I couldn't repay. There, in the snow, I had to let a being I could not categorize solve a simple problem for the dog I loved. It should have embarrassed me. Instead, it steadied me. The trade-offs in that moment were plain. Cling to pride and shiver through the night pretending control, or accept a gesture freely given and stay present for what mattered. I accepted it. A little later, one of the circling wolves let out a low whine and took 3 cautious steps inward. The giant didn't even rise this time. He turned his shoulders, lifted his palm again, and dipped his head toward the old wolf. The younger one stopped, sat back on its haunches, and waited. The whole ring held, boundary without force, over and over, like he was reminding them and himself that hunger didn't cancel dignity. I watched that exchange and thought of hospice, of a phone call, of roads and excuses, and the lie I had told myself that showing up late still counted as showing up. I kept sitting anyway. Around 2 in the morning, clouds slid over the moon and turned the meadow to softer shades of grey. By then, my toes were numb despite moving them inside my boots, and my beard had gone stiff with frost. Juniper slept with her side against my calf. The giant remained where he was, an anchored silhouette beside the old wolf's rising and falling breath. Once he reached out and brushed snow from the old wolf's muzzle with the back of his fingers, careful as if handling dry leaves that might crumble. I felt tears start and freeze at the corners before I could wipe them. Near 3, the wind dropped. Not fully gone, but less sharp, enough that I could hear the creek under ice again, and a raven shifting somewhere in the timber as if dawn had sent an advance notice. The old wolf stirred, tried to gather its legs and settled back with a small exhale. The ring tightened, then widened when the giant glanced outward. No challenge came, no panic spread. They trusted the order he held, however temporary it was. I spoke once more, quiet so the words stayed with me and didn't try to own the moment. "I see you," I said toward the meadow. "I see what you're doing." He did not look back that time. He stayed with the old wolf, and I understood that as its own answer. When the first thin light began to silver the eastern trees, I was still there on spruce boughs I had not gathered, beside a dog who slept because she felt safe, watching a giant keep vigil in the center of hungry winter without anger or spectacle. The wonder of it was no longer a spike of disbelief. It had settled into something weight-bearing, a new beam in the frame. I didn't have a theory sturdy enough to carry all of it, but I had the scene itself, and for that morning, it was enough to stay, breathe, and not look away. I stayed kneeling on those spruce boughs while the sky worked from iron grey to a thinner blue, and the change in light made every living thing in that meadow look more tired and more honest. The old wolf's sides lifted shallow now, with long pauses between. Frost had gathered along his whiskers and the edge of one ear, turning him silvered before his time. The ring of wolves held where it had held all night, some standing, some lying down with heads up, all of them fixed on the center. Juniper woke and lifted her head, then leaned into my leg without taking her eyes off the wolf. I put my glove on her neck and felt steady warmth under winter fur. That grounded me long enough to notice my own hands were shaking. I had spent a year outrunning rooms where people were saying goodbye. Hospice had become a building I drove past with my jaw locked, and my father had become a memory I handled like hot metal, brief and careful, then put down before it burned through. There, by the creek, with my knees numb and my back stiff, I felt that old argument rise up one more time. You can't fix this. You're not trained for this. Step back. Let nature do what nature does. It was the same argument I'd used at midnight by a different road. Practical on the surface. Fear underneath. Then the old wolf tried to lift his head and couldn't. It was a small movement, barely more than a tremor through his shoulders, but it reached me like someone had called my name. I started forward on instinct and stopped after 2 steps because the giant was already rising. He crossed the snow in 2 long, careful strides, not to block me, just to close distance to the wolf and look once toward me as if checking whether I meant what my body had already decided. In his left hand he carried something folded and dark. He bent, placed it on the snow between us, and nudged it gently in my direction with the back of his fingers. My truck blanket, brown wool with a red stripe at one corner, and a burn mark near the hem from when I'd set it too close to a tailpipe heater 3 winters back. I had lost it on the ridge road weeks ago and blamed myself for not tying the load down right. Seeing it there in his hand, in this meadow at first light, broke whatever thin barrier I still had between disbelief and acceptance. He had seen me before I saw him. He had watched my comings and goings, my mistakes, my patterns. He had carried what I dropped and returned it when it mattered. I swallowed hard and nodded once. I understand. He stepped back at once, giving me clear room to pass, then lowered himself to a seated position several yards off the wolf's flank, broad shoulders turned partly toward the ring, partly toward me, holding both spaces at once. No pressure, no command, just an opening. By the time I reached the old wolf, my breath was coming fast and hot in the scarf. I slung the rifle off my shoulder and set it in the snow behind me where I could not reach it without standing. I unfolded the blanket with clumsy fingers and eased it under the wolf's chest and around his ribs, lifting only as much as his body would allow. He smelled like cold fur, pine smoke from some old campfire long gone, and the thin metallic scent of winter hunger. One eye opened halfway, yellow clouded with age, still clear enough to hold me there. "I'm here," I said, and my voice cracked on the second word. "Easy now. I'm here." The ring stirred but didn't break. A younger wolf on the far side gave a low sound in its throat and took one step forward. The giant lifted his hand, palm out, and the wolf settled back again, ears flattening, then easing. Juniper came to my left shoulder and sat close, pressed against my coat, as if she knew the exact line between comfort and interference. I slid one hand under the old wolf's neck to keep his muzzle off the ice crust and pulled the blanket tighter with the other. His breathing hitched once, then found a slower pattern. A man can carry grief like ballast so long, he mistakes heaviness for strength. That morning, I felt the trade-off in my bones. I could keep clamping down, keep pretending composure was the same thing as courage, keep treating tenderness like a structural weakness. Or I could do the plain, unfixable work in front of me, witness this ending, and not flinch. I thought of the hospice nurse saying now would be a good time. I thought of my father dying at 2:17 while I slept, because I had chosen dawn over presence. I thought of Eli's voicemail, calm and hopeful, and how many times I had let that hope ring out. I bowed over the wolf and started crying before I knew I was crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just tears running hot down a face gone numb with cold, dropping onto wool and fur, breathing broken into uneven pulls I couldn't regulate. My chest hurt like I'd taken a hard fall. I kept my hand on the wolf's neck and talked to him because the words needed somewhere to go. "I missed my old man," I said. I told myself I had reasons. I told myself roads were bad, time was long, morning was soon. I was wrong. I was wrong. Juniper leaned harder into me. Behind us, the giant sat motionless, a dark, patient shape in rising light. As dawn strengthened over the next half hour, the basin began to wake in small sounds. A raven call from up a timber, ice ticking at the creek edge, wind easing down until the fir tips only whispered. The old wolf's breaths grew farther apart. I felt each one as a faint movement under my palm, then a stillness, then one more small effort. The last exhale came soft and unforced, like a tired man finally lying back after a long shift, his body settled under the blanket. No struggle, no fear in it, just release. The ring held silent for 3 heartbeats, maybe 4. Then one wolf tipped his muzzle up and gave a single low note, not a challenge, more a marker. 2 others answered from opposite sides. The sound moved through the meadow and into the trees and seemed to hang there thin and clean. I kept my hand where it was and lowered my forehead to the blanket. Grief for my father and grief for this animal. Grief for every phone call I had not answered. All of it came loose in one hard wave, and then another. I let it. There was nothing to manage anymore. When I finally looked up, the giant was watching me with that same calm attention, eyes amber brown in the early light. He did not move closer. He did not reach. He simply stayed present until my breathing steadied. I wiped my face with the heel of my glove and gave him a nod that felt more like a thank you than any words I had. "You gave me a chance," I said quietly. "I know what that was." He lowered his head once, slow and deliberate. Then, without ceremony, he reached to his right, picked up 2 smooth stones from the crust, and placed them in a crossed shape beside my boot. The same sign from my porch rail, the same quiet grammar. I looked at the stones, then back at him, and something in me settled into place. Pattern recognized, kindness repeated, not a random incident. A relationship of boundaries and regard built one gesture at a time. The wolves began to shift as a group, not rushing in, not panicked. They widened the ring first, each animal moving to create lanes through the snow. The giant rose in one fluid motion, towering over all of us, and took 3 steps backward toward the alder line. He paused there and looked from me to Juniper to the covered wolf, as if confirming the handoff was complete. Juniper stood, tail low and sweeping once. I stood too, legs stiff, and pressed my palm to my chest, before extending it toward him, an old signal my father used to mean respect where words weren't enough. "Go on," I said. "We're all right." He turned and walked into the trees. No crashing brush, no theatrical glance back. He moved through alder and young fir with that same careful weight placement I had heard for days, bending branches aside instead of breaking them, and within seconds his outline dissolved into vertical shadow and frost-lit trunks. A final set of deep tracks marked the margin where meadow met timber, then continued upslope until distance and blown snow took the edges. The absence he left behind was not emptiness. It was quiet with shape to it. The ring closed after he disappeared. 3 wolves approached the blanketed body and stood over it, with heads lowered. Another circled once and sat. None of them looked at me with threat. I backed away 2 measured steps, Juniper matching me shoulder to knee, and stopped when we reached the spruce fringe. I stayed there long enough to show I was yielding the center. One of the wolves lifted his head and met my eyes briefly, then returned his gaze to the elder. Agreement in the only terms available. The morning had turned brighter by then, sunlight finding the top branches and laying a pale gold strip along the far ridge. My gloves were soaked through at the fingertips. My knees ached when I shifted weight. Real body, real cold, real consequences. I looked down at the crossed stones beside my boot, crouched and picked them up. They were creak-smooth and heavier than they looked. I set them in my coat pocket, separate from my keys so they wouldn't chip, and felt them settle there like 2 small anchors. Juniper nudged my hand. "Yeah," I said, my voice rough but steady now. "Let's give them room." We walked the spruce edge back toward the bend, slow and quiet, stopping once to look over the meadow from a little rise. The wolves had formed a loose crescent around the elder, no longer circling, just present. The blanket's red stripe showed in the morning light. Above them, ravens crossed from west to east, calling to each other as if the day had resumed. The wind had dropped enough that smoke from my cabin chimney, far uphill and barely visible through trees, rose straight for a while before drifting. At the bend, I turned for one last look toward the alder where he had gone. Nothing moved there except sifted snow dropping from a bough. Still, I had the sense of being watched in the kindest way, not monitored, not tested, just accompanied to the edge of what I needed to do next. I put my hand over the stones in my pocket and felt the crossing of them through the wool. "Thank you," I said to the trees again, and this time I didn't laugh at myself. Juniper trotted ahead on the trail, then stopped to wait and make sure I followed. I did. By the time Juniper and I reached the cabin steps, my legs had gone wooden from cold and from holding myself together. I got the fire built up first, then stripped off wet gloves and set them on the hearthstones, because habit still took over when feelings ran high. Juniper went straight to her rug, circled twice, and dropped with a tired groan that sounded older than she was. I stood at the kitchen counter with my hands braced on the wood and let the room settle around me. Smoke, coffee grounds, damp wool, dog fur, old pine walls. Ordinary things, the kind you can touch, I took the crossed stones from my pocket and set them on the kitchen sill above the sink, side by side for a second, then crossed one over the other exactly the way he had placed them in snow. I looked at them a long time. Then I pulled out the legal pad and wrote for nearly 40 minutes without stopping, every detail I could remember while it was still clean in my mind. The wolf ring's distance, his hand signal, Juniper's posture, the blanket, the final breaths, the way the wind dropped after. I added the measurements from the creek prints on a fresh page and dated both entries. That was my old training showing up in a new way. Document first, interpret later. When my fingers warmed enough to hold the phone steady, I walked to the porch corner where one bar sometimes held and called County Wildlife Dispatch. A woman named Mara answered on the second ring, voice clipped but kind. "I've got an old grey wolf down on my property above Elk River Basin," I said. "Natural death as far as I can tell. Pack stayed with him through night. I wanted to ask what protocol is before I do anything." She asked for parcel number, nearest road marker, and whether there were signs of shooting or trap injury. I told her no to both and gave the location. Keys clicked on her end. "With weather this week, we can't send a tech right away," she said. "If there's no sign of human cause, leave it at least through tomorrow for pack behavior. If they abandon and you're concerned about dogs or proximity to your crossing, you can move or bury on your own land away from water flow. Note, date and site. Call back when done." "I can do that." "Thank you for calling it in," she said. "Most folks don't." I wrote her name and case number on the legal pad margin. External box checked. But what mattered more was that I had asked, listened, and followed through. By noon, the sky had cleared hard blue, and sunlight had that brittle winter shine that looks warm from a window and cuts your face outside. I took a shovel, a mattock, and a thermos down to the meadow edge and stopped well short. The pack was still there, wider spread now, no longer in a tight ring. I sat under spruce with Juniper and waited. I did not crowd them. I did not claim anything. Around mid-afternoon, one by one, they moved off toward the east timber, pausing only once to look back. The old wolf lay where I had left him, blanket still tucked. I waited another full hour after they were gone. By then, shadows had lengthened and the crust had softened just enough to cut. I carried him in the blanket to a south-facing knoll above the creek, where spring light comes first and floodwater never reaches. The ground fought me, frozen 2 inches down, then gravel and roots. But line work had taught me the rhythm of hard digging. Strike, pry, clear, breathe, repeat. Juniper stayed nearby, sitting when I rested, standing when I stood, never wandering far. When the pit was deep enough, I lowered him in, wrapped as he was. I set one hand on the blanket and said what I could say, without pretending I understood more than I did. "You were seen. You were not alone. That counts." I covered him slow, tamped the mound with the back of the shovel, and laid a flat stone at the head and another at the foot. Not crossed, just markers. Distinct. The crossed stones belonged to something else, and I knew it. At dusk, I called dispatch back from the porch and gave Mara the update. She thanked me, read the case note back, and said if weather improved, they might still pass through for tracks, but no further action was likely. 2 days later, she left me a voicemail. Roads remained unsafe. Report closed as natural mortality per my observations. I wrote that outcome beside the case number and underlined it once. The same afternoon as the burial, I drove to mile marker 9 for stronger signal and called Eli. He picked up on the first ring. "Dad? Hey, bud." A pause, then, "You okay?" I watched Juniper nosing snow by the turnout and forced myself not to retreat behind weather talk. "I'm okay now. I haven't been okay for a while. I'm sorry I didn't answer you." He stayed quiet, so I kept going. I missed Grandpa's last night. I told myself I had reasons, but really I was scared to sit there and feel it. After that, I started ducking everything, including you. That was wrong. You didn't do anything to deserve that. I heard him exhale. I thought you were mad at me. Never. Not once. Another pause, smaller this time. "I passed the permit test," he said. "I wanted you to know." "I'm proud of you. If you want, I'll come down Saturday and we can do a parking lot lesson. Your call." He gave a short laugh. "Mum says you still teach with your 10 and 2 sermon. Your grandpa taught me the same way. Family tradition." "Okay," he said. "Saturday. And Dad?" "Yeah. I'm glad you called." I sat in the truck after we hung up and cried a little again. Easier tears this time. Relief has its own weight. 3 days later, when roads opened, I went to Alder Creek for feed and fuel. Dale at Morrow's scanned my things, then looked up and held my gaze the way men do when they're offering one chance at honesty. "You look different," he said. "Less like you're bracing for weather." "I buried an old wolf this week," I said, "and I finally called my boy." He nodded slowly, then surprised me. "Your dad once came in here in '98, buying extra coffee. Said somebody had stacked his wood while he was laid up with a bad knee. He told me, 'Don't need to explain kindness to accept it.'" Dale set the receipt on the counter. He never brought it up again. That sat between us for a moment, warm as the propane heater by the door. "I don't know what I saw," I said. "Maybe you're not required to," he answered. "You just carry it right." That was the whole speech. It was enough. By the 3rd week of February, I returned to line work on light duty, then full rotation by March. First morning back, my foreman, Rick, tossed me a pair of insulated gloves and said, "Don't be a hero with that shoulder." I almost gave my old answer, the one about being fine, but I shook my head. "If it pulls, I'll say so," I told him. He grinned. "Look at growth." On storm calls, I still moved with urgency, but not with that old, punishing pace that treated my body like a spare part. I took breaks before shaking set in. I answered Eli when he called, even if all I had was 10 minutes between polls. Saturday driving lessons became a routine. Empty lot, then county roads. Then one careful run up the ridge where he white-knuckled the wheel and laughed when he finally relaxed. We talked about music, school, and breaks on ice. Sometimes we talked about his grandpa. I didn't dodge those anymore. In early April, I drove to the hospice parking lot after shift and sat in the truck until I could walk inside. The same nurse, or maybe one like her, met me at the desk. I gave my name and told her I only wanted to leave a thank you note for staff who had been with my father that night. She brought me an envelope and waited while I wrote. I kept it plain. "You told me the truth when I needed it. I was late, but your kindness wasn't. Thank you for staying with him." I signed my full name and handed it over with both hands. At the cabin, the basin changed by degrees. Snow retreated from south slopes first, then from the creek margins, leaving black soil and last year's grass pressed flat. The branch he'd set across that weak trail crossing was long gone by melt, but I kept avoiding that edge until it dried solid, out of respect for being warned once. The wintergreen boughs had browned and gone brittle by February. I spread them under the porch steps where they turned to sweet-smelling mulch. The crossed stones remained on my kitchen sill. I cleaned around them, never moved them far. I never submitted photos because I never took any. I had measurements, notes, dispatch records, and a memory that did not need public argument to remain true. The legal pad went into a metal document box with my dad's deed papers and Eli's first report card. Not hidden, not displayed, kept. I saw large tracks one more time in late thaw, high along the Alder margin above the meadow, heading north and away from the cabin with the same long, even stride. Juniper stood in one print, looked up at me, and wagged once. No gifts appeared after that week, and no loaded silence remained unresolved. Dale said what he knew. Dispatch closed the report. Eli answered when I called and called back when I missed him. The mystery stayed a mystery, but the debts I could pay, I paid. These days, when the house is quiet, I sometimes stand at my kitchen sink before dawn, with coffee in hand, and touch those crossed stones with 2 fingers. I think about strength the way I was taught and the way I had to relearn it. One version is climbing in bad weather, tightening bolts with numb hands, carrying weight because somebody has to. The other is kneeling in snow beside what you cannot save, and staying anyway. I used to trust only the first version. Now, I trust both. And when the timber goes still in that chapel way some evenings, I say thank you out loud, not because I expect an answer, but because I received one.